to introduce the next panel on epidemiology and data science. I'm Professor of Neuroscience and Society in the department, and I think this is a really wonderful panel to follow from the morning, because we're going to be hearing about some of the current methods in bringing together good data science and precision medicine. And really excitingly, I think you're also going to be hearing about some of the work that we're doing in the global context, and more of the work that we're doing in the global context, and also domestically trying to bring together data sets, really rethinking the direction and the design of data. So I'm not going to spend a long time introducing. John has already been up here, so I'm going to first introduce Professor John Geddes. He's director of the Oxford Health BRC, in addition to being the head of our department, and he's going to talk about large-scale digital clinic.
Thanks, Helen. Okay, thanks everyone. And I had to skip out this morning, so I missed it, but unfortunately I'll be able to catch it up on video. But what I want to talk about is some of the developments that we've made in large-scale digital phenotyping, which is so important in the area of mental health because of the inherent difficulties of trying to find out the nature and severity of mental disorders simply by asking the individual. And it's amazing when you think about it, reflect just how much we've relied on that for making diagnoses, collecting histories from patients. The idea that someone can remember how they felt or been or acted over the last week, month, year, or whatever. Quite often in research assessments, we'll ask people how they've been over the last few years. So this is a real problem in our field, but increasingly, and this is one of the more interesting things I think that I've experienced, it's recognised by colleagues across medicine when there's an issue of chronicity and variation in severity. So we're increasingly working with colleagues from in inflammatory bowel disease or in orthopedics who are faced with exactly the same problems about assessing the evolution or the course of a disorder over time. In fact, we've got worse as we moved out of the mental hospitals because Kraepelin used to make very, very intensive observations of the patients because they were in hospital and recognised the need to do so. But once we started seeing people in the community, then it became more of a problem. And we are now moving to an era where we can do this remotely and access continuous and time-stamped data collection. Now, the idea of collecting regular data from patients is not new, and it's just worth, I think, saying a little bit about colleagues who got there quite a long way before we did, but didn't have the same technical approaches or to being able to capture it. So particularly Tasha Glenn and her colleagues Peter Wybrow and Mark Bauer over in Los Angeles, Michael Bauer. This was then followed by the idea that you could sample symptoms using ecological imagery assessment. And this began to give high temporal resolution measures of both biology and behaviour. And these are a couple of early papers where they also started doing the analyses because you get much more complicated but fine detailed views of the phenotype when you measure it over the long term. And in a way, the very idea that one would try and assess a mental disorder with anything other than an approach that can look at the temporal dimension would seem to be a problem right from the beginning. More recently, Lars Kessing and his group and Maria Farhad-Jepsen have been using this approach a lot by using smartphone data in Denmark, and we collaborate with those. Our own history of this started with this true colour system, and it was really Guy Goodwin and my colleagues faced with the problem of assessing patients clinically in outpatients, but realising that we were then at a point of being able to capture data remotely. But at that time, and this was back in 2006, we used text messaging using that very old-fashioned Nokia handset. And with Will Stevens, we developed a system that sent out reminders to patients on a weekly basis and captured it. And this, from our own perspective in clinical practice, really revolutionised the way we could look after our patients. And indeed, I was in clinic with a patient who went onto the system in 2007, and he has been using True Colours ever since 2007, so that's 12 years, and he missed 5 assessments. So we had 12 years of data, weekly data from him, and could really map the variation in his mood and the way that it was linked with knee pain and various other things. And really, from his point of view, has really transformed his care. Because the problem is that remains anecdote, and trying to develop how this can create a completely new way of looking after people longitudinally has been quite challenging, although True Colours has been the uptake's been profound, and we've been augmenting it in a number of other studies with other wearable sensors. Every time one comes to the market, we use another. Currently with Stephen Friend, we're using these Aura rings that are very finely able to capture things like heart rate variability, body temperature, and sleep in a way that we just couldn't imagine just a few years ago. So that's one of the challenges, of course, is technology continues to advance, and it often takes place outside the academic sector. True Colours is now been used in over 35,000 patients, with over 1 million measures. It's become the standard measure of outcome assessment in clinical trials in the UK in mood disorders, and we're increasingly using it in cohorts both within the UK and overseas. And we do use it in clinical practice, certainly our own research clinic, and it is implemented across Oxford Health NHS Trust. And there is a particular uptake of it in the gastrointestinal service at the John Radcliffe Hospital, where they use it for measuring treatment response in inflammatory bowel disease, which has worked pretty well. So this is the overall assessment. So really quite widespread use as an outcome measurement tool. But of course the promise was always to sort of try and go beyond that, to see whether we could use that finer phenotyping to get better insights into the underlying biology of the disorder. And we were fortunate to get Wellcome Trust funding. I think John, if he's still in the audience, was involved when we first put this grant in. Paul Harrison was the lead on this, with Kean Overett, Kath Harmer and myself. And even at that time, the idea was to use these data to scale it up and to begin to link that variability in data to the underlying biology. When we started on that, I wouldn't say that we really completely nailed it. I might come back to 1 or 2 findings depending on time later on. More recently, Chris Hines, who redeveloped a lot of the True Colours system with us in the department, moved over to become a fellow in digital phenotyping at the Big Data Institute, and he's now developed the Misurio app. And again, great uptake with this. So within a day or so of launching the Game Changer app, so that's the second time there's been a Game Changer app, there is also the virtual reality one. It was used by 12,000 participants, and this is a way of capturing longitudinal cognitive functioning over time. And the Misurio will be an open platform, so we should be able to modify it looking at different disorders over time. These are a couple of the examples of the kind of analyses that we can do in longitudinal data, that we are developing relationships both with people in this Maths Institute, so particularly with Terry Lyons and his group, and with the Alan Turing Institute. And we're going to have some quite interesting findings using some of the signature-based machine learning models that Terry's pioneered. This is a paper that Kate Saunders particularly led on that discriminates borderline patients from people with bipolar disorder and normal controls by using the longitudinal mood rating data. So the current status is that these new technologies, new analysis techniques, and big data may help us understand mental illness. And we have to be in a position of taking advances that are coming out of both academic but also commercial settings, because a lot of the innovation in this area is in the large technical outfits like Apple, Google, etc. And then unless we sort of link into those, then we miss something really quite important. There are a lot of problems and challenges to overcome, including ethical problems. And at the moment, there's quite a lot of hype in the use of digital health techniques, but most of the time this is based on fairly poorly or uncertainly validated methods. This is just to flag up the ethical importance. So very briefly to finish, The next steps in digital phenotyping remain on validating against what we already know about clinical conditions. So in other words, we have this idea that you might be able to come up with new categorizations on the data itself, but actually the more we go on, the more we realize that actually we've got to link it into what is currently seen as clinical gold standard. We're increasingly working with specific groups and digital communities to move from high resolution short-term to longer-term validation studies, and a lot of that work that we've done in the department's been in partnership with Stephen Friend and his For You and Me not-for-profit outfit. And the importance of looking at the challenges of analysis, where we continue to develop relationships and collaborations with mathematics, engineering, the Alan Turing Institute and the Big Data Institute, and of course the enduring centrality, Elena, of ethics in all of this. Thank you.
Collaborations are across institutions, departments, and yes, I agree, the enduring importance of ethics being central in all of this. And I think you'll hear a bit about that in the next presentation as well. So this is by Elena Metzi and Alan Stein, talking about perinatal depression and child development. And Alan Stein is a professor of child and adolescent mental health in the department. A lot of his work focuses on low resource settings. And Elena Metzi is a postdoctoral researcher in the department.
Thanks, Elena. Elena's going to talk first, but just before that, I just want to say just a couple of words. Firstly, about Michael Gelder. He was a fantastic mentor to all of us and was just a tremendously careful and thoughtful person. I must say we all found him a little forbidding, and he wasn't easy at that, and certainly didn't suffer fools gladly, but as somebody said earlier, never personal. And I have to say, I always thought the one thing about me, he struggled a bit with what he might consider my informality. And today I thought, is this a day for a suit? And I thought, no, I'm not going to break it. I was slightly upsetting him. But he was really a wonderful person. I do want to pay special tribute to him. So Ellen and I are going to talk about prenatal depression and child development. We're going to talk about two aspects of the work we've done. We have done did a review in the last, and we actually pulled together quite a lot of this work and the impact on child development, and completed the trial 2 years ago, which was published as well, which we're not going to talk about today, but does outline a lot of the key work that we've done here. I think the key issue that I want to emphasize here is that perinatal depression and postnatal depression in particular is common, runs at about 10%, but there are big differences between the high income settings and the low middle income settings. In the high income settings, the rates are about 10%, but in the low middle income settings, the rates are at least double that. So Ellen is going to talk about one aspect of this work, and I'll talk about another aspect. Ellen will talk about the high income setting and how we identify people at high risk in the perinatal period for adverse child outcomes.
Thanks. So I'd like to start by giving you a bit of a background of where the literature was at the time that we started thinking about this question, what motivated us to work on this project. So there is consistent evidence, and actually now a considerable body of evidence, that perinatal depression increased the risk of adverse outcomes for children. And there was a report from the London School of Economics in 2013 suggesting that the cost to the healthcare and society is really large. So per 1 year birth cohort, the cost for the UK alone are 8.1 billion per year, and those are principally because of the effects of perinatal mental health problems on children's development. If you look at the literature quite closely, like we had to do, you'll see that the effects are overall variable, with mostly moderate effect sizes reported. But also that brief episodes, whilst very distressing to the mother, may actually not impact negatively on children's development. There was also a strong suggestion in the literature that persistence might be an important factor, although this hadn't really been studied systematically. And there were a couple of studies from the post-natal period that suggested this, but the overall sample sizes and the follow-up of the children were brief, so small sample size and a brief follow-up. There was also some evidence from the STAR-D studies in the US, where school-aged children were at increased risk of depression themselves when maternal depression had been more chronic and severe in nature. And at the time, enormous investments were being made in screening for perinatal mental health, and the US Preventive Task Force paper had come out in 2016, suggesting that it is beneficial for women with depression and anxiety. There was also specific mention in the paper about how women with more severe depression and more persistent depression had been underrepresented in the literature, either because of the difficulties in recruiting and retaining these women in the studies, but also because of their complex therapeutic needs that meant that often they were excluded from clinical trials. And so this project really for us was trying to identify who should be targeted in a system that is overburdened with long waiting lists, as we've heard also this morning. So I'm just going to be talking about this one paper that we published last year in Journal Psychiatry. And we looked at persistent and severe postnatal depression in particular. We used the ALSPAC study, which many of you will be familiar with, and the advantages of using that were first, the multiple measurements of children's development in multiple domains over their lifetime, the multiple measurements of maternal depression with 2 measurements in the postnatal year at 2 and 8 months that we utilized, as well as of course, the large population that is the ALSPAC study. We categorized depression for this analysis at 3 levels of severity: moderate, marked, and severe depression, and we looked at depression that was both persistent, so meeting criteria at 2 time points, or depression that was non-persistent, so meeting criteria only at the first time point at 2 months. And we also had a group of women that didn't meet criteria at either time point, so what we use as a reference group. And that gave us 7 mutually exclusive groups that really categorized severity and persistence in a stepwise function and really allowed us to look at a potential dose-response relationship with respect to children's outcomes. We used 3 key outcomes for this analysis. We used behavioral problems at 3.5 years. These were maternally reported using the Rutter scales. We used the GCSE maths grades at 16, and these were school reports, as well as depression at 18 years. This was a self-report measure. We used these 3 measures first because they span a range of development, including emotional behavioral development, as well as academic achievement, as well as the early childhood and adolescence, but also because postnatal depression had already been shown to be associated with these particular outcomes in this population. And so we were trying to really disentangle the effects of severity and persistence in the population where this association had already been reported. So this will be the one and only data slide I use today. And on the left-hand side, you can see the 7 mutually exclusive groups that separate persistence and severity of depression and our 3 outcomes. And I'll just guide you briefly through the slide. For the case of non-persistent depression, so that's the first 3 data lines, we see that there is a somewhat increased risk for behavioral problems at 3.5 years. But what you can also see is that the risk is not really different for different levels of severity. But there's no increased risk for lower maths at 16 or depression at 18. In the case of moderate and persistent depression or marked and persistent depression, again we see an increased risk, but this doesn't translate for later maths or depression. The group with consistently increased risk is that of severe and persistent depression, with a 4-fold increase for behavioral problems, a 2-fold increase for lower GCSE math scores, and a 7-fold increase in risk for depression at 18. And of course, as you might imagine, the number of women that would meet criteria for marked persistent depression and severe persistent depression is small. And so in our effort to minimize statistical complexity and to maintain the sample size, in this one we've only controlled for maternal education, which has been shown to be one of the factors considerably influencing the relation between maternal depression and children's outcome. So what are the key messages I'd like to take away from this paper? Postnatal depression, which persists beyond 6 months and is severe, really increases the risk for adverse outcomes for children. Women whose depression persists beyond 6 months should be prioritized for treatment, and this is also reinforced by another aim of the paper that we didn't have time to talk about today, that really shows that women with persistent depression, whether moderate or severe, continue to experience depressive symptoms beyond the postnatal year, all the way to 11 years after childbirth. And so to minimize the exposure of children to depression, but also to treat maternal depression and children's well-being, effective treatment and early treatment is really key. Screening twice in the postnatal year would really help identify these women. And we think there are some key policy and clinical implications of the work. So routine screening is already available in the UK at 3 months, as is recommended by NICE guidelines. But actually, due to the frequent contact with health professionals, screening twice in the postnatal year once more in the second half would really be possible. This might lead to increased treatment costs and increased identification of women who might require treatment, but actually the overall cost to the public sector experiencing mental health problems is 5 times that of improving services. And I hope we've made the point that early intervention and effective treatment for perinatal depression are really a public health priority. And as Alan alluded, we did complete a trial for persistent depression in particular that showed that it is possible to deliver effectively treatment with high rates of sustained remission 1 year after the end of treatment using home-based delivery of psychological therapy. And we were very privileged that our publication was accompanied by an editorial by Myrna Wiseman, who really put apart the issues of severity and persistence, but also really highlighted the implications for this, also for the US context, where the US Preventive Task Force had suggested universal screening only for pregnancy, and here the evidence is clear that in order to target children, screening in the postnatal should be also a priority. Thank you.
Great. So what I'm going to do is focus on the high-risk groups in low middle-income countries. But so what the evidence has shown, we're going to talk about moderators here, is that persistence of the persistence postpartum with a high-risk group, those in socioeconomic adversity is another well-identified high-risk group, as well as those with multi-morbidity, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Before going to the lab, I just want to show you just briefly one study that we're involved in, every effort we ran. And this is a slightly complex slide, so I won't go into too much detail, but what it's basically showing that if you look at the relationship between postnatal depression and children's language at 3 years of age, for those women in the higher socioeconomic categories, there is very limited effect on the child's language. But for those in the low socioeconomic categories, the effect isn't quite marked. I won't go into explain what these are because there's a combination of moderate and mediate effect. There is an effect on language, but effects are very significantly marked for those in poor circumstances, facing much more socioeconomic adversity. So translate that into families living in socioeconomic adverse circumstances in low middle income countries, and you see that we have a more significant problem which we need to think about. So in some of the work we've done, we've shown that in addition to what we know about the kinds of things that Eleanor showed, we've also shown that stunted growth occurs in the context of postnatal depression, and that stunting, and the stunting is defined as below the 3rd centile for length at 2 years of age, mediates later behavioral problems. So there's quite a strong link between biological and behavior. And we've also in the same follow-up to show in this very large cohort that there are increased emotional and behavioral problems at 10 years. But I want to focus on HIV because HIV has slightly gone off the radar for many people, but it shouldn't, because it's a very important issue. If you go to an antenatal clinic in many parts of Southern Africa and even in East Africa, the rates of HIV are very high. They can be between 25 and 40%. So approximately every 3rd woman sitting in an antenatal clinic has got HIV. That's an enormous figure, given that the risks are multiple in terms of adversity, in terms of potential transmission to children. Now, the rollout of antiretroviral medication has made an enormous difference to these families' lives, and has largely reduced the chance of transmission, but there's still major risks here. So, the screening of HIV has very much been targeted at pregnancy because that's the time to intervene medically in terms of providing medication to reduce the risk. But what that means is that for many women, they're being diagnosed with HIV while at the same time being told they have a new baby coming into this world. That's a very difficult situation to be in. So it brings into many questions about validity of relationships. Where did I get this from? Did my partner have it? How did I know? Where did he get it from? There's a lot of stigma. And we also know that for a lot of people, there's diminished social and material support, and not surprisingly, depression. So we did a study, in fact, it was done by my then PhD student. She's much more grown up now, Tamsin Roshan, and published in JAMA in 2006, showing more than almost 3 times raised risk for women who are HIV positive during pregnancy. And we found very strong associations as well with negative cognition about healthcare and about the kinds of things that they may be, the way they're going to be treated. Obviously, things have improved in the last decade with the rise of antiretroviral therapy, and that has also reduced stigma, but it's still a very important issue. The question is, how are you going to deal with therapies? And I think Chris mentioned it earlier on, the importance of very little psychological therapy, psychological specialists being available, and of delivering therapy through lay healthcare workers, people who don't have specialist treatments, who don't have specialist training, but who you can train to deliver therapy, and that's what really been the focus of a lot of our work has been. Initially, for this group, the HIV positive group, we weren't the original ones to develop it. We evaluated a large evaluation of what's called mentor mothers. In other words, women who have HIV positive, who've had the baby a while ago, get trained to run groups for other women who have HIV during pregnancy, and using fairly simple psychological techniques. And I think there was a lot of suggestion this might be helpful, and our study, our trial, showed that it was actually helpful. It reduced levels of depression, there was improvements in infant growth, and improvements in exclusive breastfeeding rates. But we found there were significant dropout rates, that expecting a person to travel 5-10 miles in a hot climate, often without public transport, to a clinic for a person was not an easy thing. Many managed it, but many didn't, and really in terms of sustainability, there are issues. I have to say, the Mental Mother program has been pushed on by charities around the world, but there are issues about how sustainable it really is for the most at risk. So we have developed a home-based therapy delivered by lay counsellors, which combines behavioural activation with an early infant stimulation program, and we actually incorporated the infant stimulation program as part of the behavioural activation for those who knew behavioural activation. Delivered by lay counsellors, we had a pilot study funded by the MRC, which was successful and showed some very nice findings, and now we've been funded by the MRC Welcome to the NIH Joint Global Health Trial to do a large trial, and we're in the middle of that now. It's very challenging, a very challenging environment for those of my colleagues sitting there who know what I'm talking about, but it's been very interesting and certainly something we're very keen to pursue. So in conclusion, the effects on children are not inevitable. It's very important to know. If someone has depression, it's not inevitable that the children will be affected. We need to focus on the groups who are most at risk, high-income groups, especially those who have persistent depression, in low middle income groups, persistent depression, but also social adversity and what you might call multi-morbidity, so depression combined with HIV. In the context of HIV comorbidities, the adversity is multiplied, and evidence-based interventions are urgently needed. I don't want to have time for it, but fathers and partners are key. My colleague, Pura Jandani, who was here as a PhD student originally and went through the Welcome MRC fellowship scheme, as part of his PhD, published a very nice paper in the Lancet showing that the effects of paternal depression on children are also there. And interestingly, what he found was particularly like young boys. But in a follow-up study by his now student, we found that the effects in terms of adolescent depression are principally on girls. So there is an effect on adolescents, but it's not on boys, it's on girls. It's not a strong effect, and the effects are only a small proportion we do, but it is significant. So we have a very big collaborating team. This is not a one-person band. I've been very privileged to work with a lot of colleagues for many, many years, and they've done an absolutely fantastic job, and really been a very cohesive team. The people who are not speaking today or tomorrow, just want to single out Valerie West, who's been a backbone of so much of what we've done over the last 15 or 20 years. We've been very generously funded. The Welcome has supported us for 30 years, but many other funders have been very generous as well. Thank you very much.
Eleanor for, I think, bringing us back to that emphasis on systemic thinking, both in low and middle income settings and of course also here at home. So I now want to introduce Professor Charles Newton, who is a professor of child and adolescent mental health in the department, also focusing on child development in low and middle income countries.
It's always a pleasure to follow Alan. Both of us were born and brought up in Africa. As you can see, he walks around in short-sleeved shirt, and I've got a jersey and jacket and almost thermal vest as well. So there's obviously a difference in our thermal regulation. A lot of themes that I'm going to mention this afternoon have already been mentioned previously. The first thing I'd like to point out to you is that in low and middle income countries, and particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and in Asia, there is a massive population growth. And this has been due to the fact that the infant mortality, which is, as you can see, is by the bar charts from the 1950s all the way to 2025, which is projected. And the sub-Saharan Africa ones are the dark blue ones, and as you can see, it's declining rapidly during that period of time. And this has obviously been associated with the increase in population growth, which you can see on the red line. And what this means is that there is there's been a shift between the prevention of infectious diseases now into non-communicable diseases. And in particular, it is becoming more evident that mental health disorders are playing a much more important role in low and middle income countries than ever before. They were largely disregarded because of the emphasis on trying to prevent infections. And so I've been involved in the global burden of disease to try and work out what the actual burden is and how this is changing over the period of time. And what I'm going to say this afternoon is, I can say it because I've been involved, so it's a criticism against myself. So when I criticize GBD, it's also a criticism against myself. But this is really, I think, an initiative which was started off in the WHO and then moved to the University of Washington in Seattle, where the Institute of Health Metrics with Murray and Lopez. And essentially, it is a way of trying to measure the burden of disease, principally by using DALYs, and we can use that to rank the disorders and also look at trends over time. So this is a map of intellectual disability. And as you can see, the most of the intellectual disability occurs in sub-Saharan Africa and in Asia, particularly in India. This is the map of autism. As you can see, there's almost no autism at all in sub-Saharan Africa. And most of it is concentrated around either Australia or North America, with also a very high proportion in the UK. And the reason for this is because those are the areas which are collecting the best and most robust statistics. You've already heard, this map is very similar to the map that William showed with regard to depression. And you've heard two things today during the day. One is from Chris Fairbairn about the proportion of depression in India, that is a major problem. And the second thing is the perinatal depression that occurs in sub-Saharan Africa, that Alan's just alluded to, is about twice that occurs in high-income countries. So this data has to be taken with a degree of skepticism. And what has happened is that it's based very much on modeling and using the data that is available, normally from contiguous countries, to try and extrapolate into the country that we have no data. So this is the time trend of neurodevelopmental disorders, and as you can see, it's a flat line, and when you look at the increase that occurred in the United States of America, this is not picked up by this form of modeling. So one of the things that we've been doing is that we have been trying to collect data. Up on those data that I've just shown you are the global burden of disease in 2016, so they collect all the data up until the end of 2015. And subsequently, there's been 2 studies which have looked at neurodevelopmental disorders and in particular autism. One by one of my colleagues, Angelina Kakuzu, on the outskirts of Uganda, on the outskirts of Kampala in Uganda. And there she found a prevalence of about 8.5 per 1,000. But that was based on a relatively small study, and I'm going to describe to you a study that we did we completed, which is a much larger study. We've been particularly interested in working in the most vulnerable populations, and so we've chosen 2 areas which are where the most vulnerable populations occur within Kenya. And both of these circumstances are embedded within demographic surveillance sites. And this is important because that means that we are measuring the deaths, births, out-migration, in-migration 3 times a year, which means that we probably have more accurate data on the actual denominator than we do have in the UK. So they do represent a really robust way of doing epidemiological studies in that context. So this was one of the first studies which was done by one of my colleagues, Simon Kariuki, and to look at emotional and behavioral problems in young children. He looked at a survey of 3,500. These were randomly selected from the Kalifi demographic surveillance site. And they were screened, and we used the child behavior checklist as a way of trying to work out the emotional and behavioral problems. And as you can see from this diagram, this slide, that the prevalence is actually quite high. So the prevalence, for example, I will take you to anxiety on this basis was in the order of about 12.6%. For ADHD was about 5%, and pervasive disorders was 5.3%. So these conditions are occurring in the context of a rural part of sub-Saharan Africa. And therefore, those pale areas in the maps that I've shown you previously are really very poor representation of actually the burden that occurs in that context. The other thing that is important to point out is that the risk factors, perinatal risk factors obviously are common with the with risk factors in the West, and seizure disorders was also came out, which is very common in that context. But the consumption of cassava, which is we think is probably a marker of poverty, because people who are poor generally eat cassava rather than any other compound because it's easier to grow and it's drought resistant. But it may also have some neurotoxic effects. As some of you may know, for example, rare diseases such as Congo, which occurs in isolated parts of sub-Saharan Africa. And the house status is the poorer the house status. This again was associated with an increased prevalence. The other thing that we've been doing is looking at autism within sub-Saharan Africa. And as I looked at the PubMed about 3 or 4 weeks ago, of the 40,000 papers published on autism, there were less than 100 which had actually represented any data from Africa, and that represents, for a population of 1 billion people, that represents an underrepresentation of the amount of research that occurs. But there are some significant problems, and this is Amina Abdukar and I, Amina's a Kenyan psychologist, have been working on trying to develop tools in order to screen for and identify autism. We've looked at a variety of different tools. We've taken tools from the West, for example, like ADOS and things like that. But there have been quite significant difficulties in trying to adapt these tools in terms of identifying, for example, social communication and such like. And this has been quite a long and tortuous process. But we are now getting to places that we can actually be confident in the tools that we're using, both for screening and for diagnosis of autism. The difficulty, of course, is a lot of these tools cost money, and therefore they're not going to be useful in rural or poor areas, and that we often lack people trained in order to administer the tools. So there's very few psychologists in sub-Saharan Africa, and most diagnoses will have to be made by either general physicians, pediatricians, or nursing staff. So the study that I alluded to earlier was a study that we conducted again in Kalifi, and it is essentially 11,000 children that we surveyed, and the bottom line was that our prevalence of autism, if you take away adjusting for the sensitivity of the tools that we use, was in the order of about 13 per 1,000, 1.3%, which is not dissimilar from the UK. And that for ADHD was about 7%. So therefore these conditions do occur commonly in this context. More recently, we've been fortunate to get funding from the Stanley Institute, and Victoria Domenel has been leading this program to look at the genetics of neurodevelopmental disorders, particularly autism and ADHD. And this is particularly important because of the genetic heterogeneity that occurs in Africa, which is much greater than anywhere else in the world. And then finally, I'd just like to mention that we're not only just involved in trying to identify, but we're also very keen to support the families that occur with the children with these disorders. And so we've done a wide range of initiatives in terms of public awareness, microfinancing, and some low cost interventions as well. And more recently, we've just partnering with colleagues in Ethiopia to look at the World Health Organization Caregiver Skills Program, which is a program which is being rolled out. And our preliminary results from an MRC-funded trial suggest that, first of all, it's very well accepted by the families, and secondly, that it seems to be making an impact on this pilot. And we're just about to put in an application for a much larger funding. So, in conclusion, what I'd like to emphasize, mental health disorders in children is rapidly becoming important in many low and middle income countries. The burden is completely underestimated. The challenges in detection and screening are considerable, but are solvable. And that the prevalence is probably the same as in the Western countries. The risk factors may be different, and in particular the genetics may be different, but there is an urgent need to develop low-cost and scalable interventions, particularly in resource-poor areas. Thank you.
Charles, and we are now moving on to Keith Wharton, who is a professor in the department and the director of the Centre for Suicide Research, and will be, I think, talking to us about the rather amazing impacts that your centre has had.
Thanks very much. When Sina Fazell asked me to give this talk, I said, well, I'll give a couple of examples of our work. And he said, no, I also want you to talk about what you've been doing over the last N years. And I said, well, in 10 minutes. And he said, we can have 15. So, so I'm going to first of all give you a quick overview of some of the studies and outputs that we've been involved in over 40 years. And then a couple of examples of hopefully reasonably high impact work that we've done. So back in, it must have been around late 60s, 1970, Michael Gelder sent John Bancroft down to the Radcliffe Infirmary next door here and said to him, John, go and sort out this problem, all these people presenting with overdoses, which was started to take off at that time. John, in his wisdom, decided to first of all, do research on the problem before designing interventions to try and help. And so he did an epidemiological study, and then in 1976 we established the Oxford self-harm monitoring system, through which we collect data on all self-harm presentations to now the John Radcliffe Hospital. I think it's the longest running monitoring system of its kind in Europe. And then from 2000 onwards, we established a multi-center study with colleagues in Manchester and Derby to provide a more representative picture of self-harm, and that now forms the basis of a lot of the studies that we do. We've always taken an interest in children and adolescents, a lot of which you've heard about today, both in terms of studying what sort of characteristics of young people who self-harm, but also we wanted to know about self-harm that was occurring in the community. And about, it must be 18 years ago now, we did the first large-scale school survey in the UK of this problem. We're always interested in the outcome following self-harm, and obviously particularly suicide, self-harm being the strongest predictor of future suicide. But we've also been looking at other causes of death, and we're currently very much engaged in this at the present time. My colleague Goliath, who's here, is working hard on this. We've been interested in the impact of unemployment on suicidal behaviour, and we took a particular interest in looking at the impact of the 2008 recession, and showed that impacts differed according to the impact in terms of suicidal behaviour, differed according to the local impacts on unemployment. We've also taken an interest in media influences on suicidal behaviour. Initially, particularly with Sue Simpkin, who's here. I'm very pleased to see her. She worked with me for around 30 years and was hugely supportive in our work. We initially started looking at the impact of TV programs, then newspapers, and more recently we've been doing some work on internet influences. We've looked at suicide in high-risk groups through psychological autopsy studies, where one interviews families of people who died and looks at their records to try and build up a profile and an understanding of contributory factors. And we were commissioned by the Department of Health to do national studies of this in farmers, doctors, female nurses, which were high-risk groups at the time. And we did a regional study of young people who died by suicide, and then a very large-scale study, this was led by Dan Harwood and done in collaboration with Robin Jacobi, of suicide in older people. About 10 years ago, we started looking with Sina at suicidal behaviour in prisons. You know that's a major problem, and in particular some studies of prisoners who'd made very highly lethal suicide attempts to try and understand factors contributing to suicide. We've taken an interest in interventions and being involved in a number of treatment trials, both locally and also with colleagues elsewhere in the country and internationally, and also Cochrane reviews on the impacts of interventions following self-harm, and these have contributed to current NICE guidance on management of this problem. We've done quite a lot of work on relative toxicity of the drugs commonly involved in both fatal and non-fatal suicidal behaviour, and I think we now, with advice from Phil Cowan, for which I'm very grateful, have completed analyses looking at this in all the major groups of drugs that are involved. And we've done it by comparing deaths from suicidal behaviour involving specific drugs relative to their use for non-fatal overdoses. On the other hand, we've also been interested in drugs in terms of their prevention of suicidal behaviour, and with John and Andrea Cipriani, we've looked at the impact of lithium, and I think shown there's reasonably good evidence that it can be preventative of suicidal behaviour. And more recently, with Rupert McShane, we've been looking at the impact of ketamine on people who are suicidal. We've taken a great deal of interest in restriction of access to means for suicide, which is being shown to be the most effective way of preventing suicide. It obviously doesn't prevent the causes, but seems to have positive effects. In particular, analgesics, and I'll give you a couple of examples in a moment, and with an international group on the use of pesticides for poisoning. Pesticides account for about 20 to 25% of suicides globally, as pesticide ingestion, and we ran what I think is the largest randomized trial on suicide prevention recently in Sri Lanka. We've been very interested in the development of services, particularly for self-harm patients, and the service which was established back in the late 1970s was the pioneering service of its kind in the UK, and this was involving psychiatric nurses in the front line of providing assessment and aftercare. And then finally, we've had a recent interest with colleagues from health economics in the healthcare costs of self-harm. We've produced a number of resources. Here are some examples. Sue Simkin worked with me in producing the first version of Help Is at Hand, which some of you will know is a guide for people who've been bereaved by suicide. This isn't the original version we produced, but it's an updated version, production of which has been led by people bereaved by suicide. With Kate Saunders, we produced a guide on assessment of suicide risk in people with depression. This was primarily aimed at general practitioners. And then more recently, a guide for Public Health England on management of suicide clusters. That was in 2015 with Karen Lascelles, who's the trust lead on suicide prevention, plus some other colleagues. And we've just submitted a very updated version of this to Public Health England, unfortunately because of the experience of clusters in schools and particularly in universities, which some of you may be aware of. In an NIHR program grant, we interviewed nearly 40 parents and carers of young people who'd self-harmed and produced this Health Talk, Health Talk Online as it was called then, website for parents and carers. And then this guide for parents and carers, hard copies of which are just being distributed by the Charlie Waller Memorial Trust, and they've already issued 35,000 copies free of charge, and hopefully that's benefiting parents who are dealing with this problem. And then more recently, a guide for school staff, also being produced by the Charlie Waller Trust and disseminated through various schools. The last thing I'd like to mention in terms of outputs is our annual research workshops on suicide and self-harm, where we invite people from all over the UK, Northern Ireland, and also visitors from abroad. And these have been running annually, at which we discuss research methodology and so on. And most importantly, while they involve senior researchers, we've increasingly had numbers of early career researchers, and that's been very rewarding. And last October we had our 25th annual meeting. So it's been in existence half of the time of the department. Okay, so that's a bit about our work, and a couple of examples of, saw in the opening sequence, we saw something about paracetamol packs, those of you who were here then. So I'm going to say a little bit about this work. And legislation was introduced in September 1998 to restrict pack sizes of paracetamol. Basically this was to reduce packs in pharmacies from up to 100 tablets to a maximum of 32 tablets, and in other outlets, which are extensive in this country, from 24 tablets to 16. In pharmacies, only 32 tablets maximum can be sold. In other outlets, they are allowed now to sell up to 2 packs. It was restricted to 1 pack at a time. The reason for this was there was concern about the numbers of deaths from paracetamol overdose. And we'd done an interview study up at the John Radcliffe of about 60 people who'd taken paracetamol overdoses. And we showed these are often taken impulsively, people saying they thought, about 60% saying they thought about it for 15 minutes or less, that they often took what was readily available, particularly in the household, and the size of the overdose was related to the amount available. So that had quite an influence on the CSM, or Committee of Safety of Medicine's decision to introduce this legislation. And we've done 3 evaluations of the impact of this. This is the second evaluation where the BMJ, in the old style BMJ, a British Medical Journal gave us the honour of a front cover representation, so you can see already what the results were that we found. And this was a summary of the impact of that stage. So in the 3 to 4 years following introduction of the legislation, there seemed to be a reduction in the number of tablets taken in overdoses, the mean number, and particularly large overdoses, a reduction in large overdoses, a reduction in admissions to the liver units, and liver transplants for paracetamol poisoning, a reduction of about 30%, and most importantly, a reduction in deaths from paracetamol overdose, again of around 30%, which amounted to 118 fewer deaths at that time. And then a few years ago, we did a 10-year evaluation of the impact of the legislation. And what we did was quite simple. We did a projection of the trend prior to the legislation and what actually happened. These are quarterly deaths by suicide in England and Wales. And just summarising the impact, we found that there had been a 40% reduction in suicides, which was about 760 fewer deaths, and when you included accidental deaths, this was about 900, almost 1,000 fewer deaths. So it seemed to be reasonably impactful. Can't say it's all due to reduced pack sizes, because the treatment of paracetamol poisoning has also improved, and N-acetylcysteine treatment has got better. Unfortunately, this hasn't got through to the USA. This is a recent drum of paracetamol, recently purchased drum from a supermarket in the USA, but the message hasn't got there yet. Okay, very briefly, I'm going to tell you about the coproximol story. Coproximol was a combination of paracetamol and dextropropoxyphene. Dextropropoxyphene is an opiate, extremely dangerous in overdose. It was being very widely prescribed. It was only a prescription-only drug, but very widely prescribed in England, usually in large amounts. And we did our first relative toxicity study back in 2003, where we looked at the relative toxicity of coproximol by comparing deaths to non-fatal overdoses. And we showed that coproximol was 28 times more toxic in overdose than paracetamol, 3.5 times more toxic than amitriptyline. It was involved in 1 in 5 poisoning suicides in the UK, which is 5% of all suicides. And as a result of this report, the MHRA investigated the drug, the efficacy and safety profile, and in 2005, at the beginning of 2005, announced its withdrawal, a 3-year period where no new patients were to be prescribed the drug, and 2008, full withdrawal. And this basically shows what happened in red. The red line shows the trend in coproximol suicides before the withdrawal, during the initial withdrawal phase and afterwards, and showed you the big impact of the withdrawal. But most importantly, it shows deaths, suicides involving all other analgesics, the black line, and you can see there was no evidence of substitution at that stage. So it seemed to be an effective intervention. In fact, summarising those data, we found a 60% reduction in suicides, amounting to 500 fewer deaths during a 6-year period, and 600 fewer deaths when you included accidents. This had some international effects. We presented our data to the European Medicines Agency, and the agency decided to withdraw dextropropoxamine throughout the EU. Unfortunately, we're losing the medicines agency to Amsterdam because of the Brexit fiasco. However, I won't go there. And in the following year, the FDA stopped production of the drug in the USA, and it was also withdrawn elsewhere, for example, in Canada and New Zealand. So hopefully I've given you a bit of an idea of what we've been doing in the last 40 years, and hopefully we've actually had some benefits, produced some benefits from this work. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith, for that extraordinary legacy. And I was slightly worried there for a moment, because I've been asked to give these flowers to you, and congratulations for your retirement. But I did a brief consultation at the front row, and apparently there's no danger of you retiring. And so I would like to, on behalf of the department, give you this as a Lifetime Achievement Award. Okay, next I'd like to introduce Sana Suri, who is going to be speaking to us about the LifeBrain project. And Sana is a researcher in the department and also at the Wellcome Center for Integrative Neuroimaging.
Thank you, Lena. What a brilliant lineup of talks to follow on from. We will see how incredibly successful the department has been. But I also wanted to add that it's just a really fun place to work. I've been here about 7 years now, and it's really a privilege to stand here and speak to you today. So I'm going to talk about the LifeBrain project. LifeBrain is a very large multi-center collaboration of 13 partner sites across 7 European countries, and it's a project that's funded by the EU Horizon 2020 grant. The goal of LifeBrain is to optimize the use of existing European neuroimaging cohorts to sort of identify new determinants of brain, cognitive, and mental health disorders across the lifespan. So there are a number of cohorts that make up this consortium. There are 11 largely longitudinal neuroimaging cohorts spread across the 7 countries. Oxford's contribution to LifeBrain is the Whitehall imaging study that was conducted here between 2012 and 2016, where 800 people received brain scans and cognitive tests at FIMR. So we've got a range of cohorts here that are looking at young adults in developmental studies, older adults, people looking at cognition, people looking at depression and anxiety. So there's a very sort of comprehensive range of measurements of cognitive health, mental health, genetics, and brain imaging data that we're bringing together in this cohort. There are about 12,000 participants when we pool it all together. About 28,000 unique observations, so one for each person for each time point in longitudinal studies, and about 5,000 to 8,000 brain scans. And for the Whitehall, I've put a TBC for the longitudinal because I'll be doing a follow-up in a subset of these participants over the next 3 years for my fellowship. So this is our protocol paper, essentially the goal of LifeBrain is to standardize and integrate all of this data across the cohorts and to link them as well to other databases like biobanks and birth registries so that we can identify early life risk and protective factors for our later life brain and cognitive outcomes. And in doing so, we also want to look at sort of the pathways and moderators for these associations. So in this case, that will be genetics, brain structure, function, and a variety of health markers. Within LifeBrain, we're interested mainly in dementia, and we've seen from the Lancet paper a couple of years ago that about 1/3 of dementia cases worldwide can be theoretically prevented by modifying certain lifestyle factors, and these are the ones that I've listed up here. Now, these lifestyle factors, the way in which they affect dementia risk is obviously varied and complex, but most of them act at least partially through the cardiovascular system. So we know that education or proxy for lower socioeconomic status is associated with a higher incidence of cardiovascular events. Hypertension, of course, is a marker of vascular health. Obesity, smoking, as well can have some bearing on cardiovascular health. Depression, we know that if you are depressed and you've had a heart attack, you're at a higher risk of getting a second heart attack. And the same for inactivity and diabetes as well. So studying this heart-brain association is quite important because, as I said, this risk is modifiable through timely interventions of lifestyle or medicine. And it has direct implications on dementia policy. So last year, the NHS health checks added a heart age test for dementia screenings in the UK. So within Life Brain, we wanted to sort of, so within Whitehall specifically, we wanted to look at this heart-brain relationship in a bit more detail, and specifically asking how and when vascular risk factors begin to affect blood flow to the brain. So we did this in 116 participants of the Whitehall cohort who did not have a clinical diagnosis of dementia. Participants were sort of followed up every 5 years for 20 years at UCL. And they came in from age 48 every 5 years until they were 68, and we measured vascular risk using the Framingham risk score. So this is a risk score that's very widely used in primary care settings to predict your likelihood of developing a heart disease in the next 10 years. And it combines a lot of the risk factors that I mentioned earlier. A year after their latest cardiovascular health assessment, they came into Oxford for an MRI scan, and we quantified CVF using arterial spin labeling MRI. So first we were interested in how cumulative vascular risk over the 20-year period affects blood flow to the brain in older age. And we found that higher cumulative risk was associated with lower blood flow to all the brain regions that are shown in yellow up there. So it's a fairly widespread effect, but most pronounced in the posterior and parietal cortices. Next, we were interested in how much of this total effect is due to the early life cardiovascular risk and how much of it is due to the later measurements. So we looked at risk at each phase, and we found that a lot of this total effect was already apparent at the earliest measurement at age 48. And as we go on, the strength of this effect declined or became progressively less pronounced to the point where the most recent measurement of vascular risk was not significantly associated with blood flow to the brain. And this may seem a bit counterintuitive, but it's actually in line with a lot of the epidemiological evidence placing midlife hypertension and obesity as risk factors for dementia rather than the later life measurements of these factors. This is just a forest plot sort of showing you the results of the regression. So there you see the standardized regression coefficients and the bars of the 95% confidence intervals. And you can just see kind of the only ones that come out as having a significant relationship is the phase 3 or the earliest measurement of Framingham risk across the frontal, temporal, parietal, and occipital lobes. We also find a positive association of MOCA with CVF, particularly within the temporal lobe, and so people who have a higher cognitive score have higher blood flow to the brain, which is also in line with the literature. So this study was only conducted within Whitehall. Now, we want to sort of, there are other cohorts within LifeBrain that have ASL scans and cardiovascular health measurements, so for the next step, we really want to take it forward within that entire consortium. And there are a couple of exciting ways in which we could do that. So the first, I'm going to use a little apple analogy here and see how far it goes. We have a meta-analysis approach where all the data are analyzed locally within each of the 13 sites, but we have standardized statistical scripts that are developed centrally and then sent out to all of the sites. So we've got each site will run the same stats on its data, and we can derive sort of summary measures from each site, and we pool them together to get a pooled measure of effect size. So in this way, the data kind of stays where it is, so we don't have to have very sophisticated data management or sharing infrastructure in place. The other is a mega-analysis approach, where we are pooling all of the apples into a uniform recipe, which perhaps has a more fulfilling outcome, but it's a lot more complicated, because in this case, one of the requirements is that all the data have to be nearly identical. And in a retrospective multi-center study like this, that can be quite a complex harmonization process. So in this case, we would be standardizing the raw data and applying the same pre-processing and analysis and statistics to all of the scans. Now, I don't know how well this metaphor is going to hold up in 2 weeks after Brexit, but here's hoping. So I can't go into all of the details of all of the meta-analyses that are currently going on in LifeBrain, but I thought I'll give you an overview of some of the studies that we're conducting. So one is a study that we're reaching out into the public to gather their perceptions of brain health and their ideas about personalized brain health strategies. And we're using that to then inform a European policy paper on brain health. The other is a meta-analysis on depression and sleep and its effects on brain health, and one on socioeconomic status and across the lifespan and its effect on cognition. We're also looking at how proximity to green space and forests can have an impact on cognitive health in older age. And then we're doing a change study on how change in white matter affects change in cognition as well. There's also a study looking at personality and a study on hippocampal integrity in people with preserved episodic memory. So I thought I'll end with a few quotes from the public interviews that we did for the first study. And this was a study that has 2 arms. So we have a quantitative part of the study, which is going to be through an online survey that we'll launch later this summer. And we aim for this to have a global reach, hopefully over thousands of responses. We also did a qualitative interview, which was one-to-one interviews in last year across 4 of the partner sites that are part of LifeBrain. And this was a little bit interesting, because I've never done a qualitative study before, and it was nice to sort of get some face-to-face reactions from people about how they perceive some of the messaging that we as scientists are doing with our results. So first we wanted to assess how aware people actually are about some of the risk factors that I mentioned earlier. And we know that getting awareness out there is important, but the next stage is to see how likely people actually are to adopt lifestyle changes to reduce their risk for some of those factors. So we found that people were generally quite aware of how lifestyle affects the brain. But people said that they didn't really think about their brain health as much as they thought about the health of their heart, for example. So they said most people, if they have a healthy brain, they do not think about their brain. So prevention of brain health disorders is not really at the top of people's minds. Next, we looked at how likely people are to turn that awareness into action. And here as well, we found that people were a bit confused. They lacked the information that they needed to adopt certain changes. So one person said, the trouble is that the papers and news are full of one day, you must eat more carbs, the next day, you must eat more protein. And the trouble is that even amongst the medical professionals, there's no consensus about what's right. So clearly, we have to be doing a bit more in getting our messaging out there a bit more clearly. And the last was, I really liked some of the feedback that we got when we asked people what they thought their most trusted sources of information were. So there were a lot of varied opinions here. So someone said, not bloody stuff in some newspaper. One was very strongly against TV. TV is a complete manipulation of the whole population. And then we clearly had some Europhiles in this cohort, none of that American stuff. So with that, I just wanted to thank everyone that's part of the LifeBrain group, Klaus and Claire, who are my supervisors in psychiatry, and the whiteboard team as well, and all of our participants. Thank you. Thank you very much.
data, the way it's collected, and how it's managed as well. Welcome, John.
So obviously dementia is taking shape in my head.
It's a very late sign, though.
This is a very late sign. Okay, so very great pleasure to, a privilege actually, to be addressing you all. This is quite some department, thank you. And to follow on from HIV, depression, anxiety, paranoia, PTSD, suicide, with pouring big data is quite a challenge. First of all, I'd like the Dementias Platform UK team who are here to stand up. This is to see how many of them were loyal. Divine, Catherine. Okay, that's it. And we have an ex-member up there as well, Nemanja. I point this out because the DP UK is a very complex project. It has over 25 work packages, 100 scientists associated with it around the UK. According to ResearchFish, 160 publications, which I'm not sure I believe, 9 academic partners, 8 industry partners. I would just like to particularly thank Ivan, who leads our recontact and recruitment, and Sarah, who is responsible for our data curation, and Catherine Calvin, who is probably our senior analyst and the most rigorous of our epidemiologically trained analysts. And I want to acknowledge your contributions. How many of you have been to the Oxford Natural History Museum? Okay. How many of you have second sign. How many of you have looked at the front door? Over the front door. Can you tell me what's over the front door? Okay, there's this carving over the front door. Do you know what the carving is of? I'll give you a close-up. It's an angel holding a petri dish with some live cells in it in one hand and a good book in the other hand. And the point is that as you go into that museum, and it's also, if you notice, very ornate in a pre-Raphaelite way. Professor Ackland, the Regis professor who had this museum, who was the driving force behind this museum, was making the point that it is the big questions that drive scientific progress. So what I'm really going to ask today is, what are the big questions for achieving cultural change in cognitive health? And I'm going to suggest that it all focuses on the data environment, and that we're going to look at the direction of collecting data, the design of collecting data, and the management of data. So really we want to go from treating brain disease, because frankly it's too late. This is a relentless condition. It is a stigmatizing condition, and if you're treating brain disease, you are bringing people into a clinical context. And you would much rather move towards a prevention situation where you're promoting brain health, you're encouraging science and trials for everyone, and you're doing this in a non-clinical brain health center context. And if you talk to Claire Mackay, this has been her dream for many, many years, and I sincerely hope that she is able to use the BRC and other resources, leverage other resources to achieve this. So I think this has to be the way to go. If we want to really shift the distribution in brain health, that's what we need to do. Trying to treat it, when somebody's got mild cognitive impairment, the brain is pretty well mashed and that they've lost an awful lot. So let's go earlier. Let's look at a design feature, next generation measurement. We want to move, and to this slide I owe much to Chris Hines, we want to move to near continuous cognitive measurement. In fact, we want to move to near continuous measurement in every field. So for example, and I'll be very, very brief here, if you do a classic epidemiologic study, you will measure cognitive function using either a laptop computer or even worse, a paper and pencil questionnaire. You'll measure it on that day, on one occasion, then you'll come back in 5 years' time and try and detect change. And of course, many things have changed. Frankly, they had a very bad day the first day, they had a much better day the second day. So they became more intelligent over time. And this is counterintuitive, but we do observe it in some data sets. We want to move to a situation where we have very frequent cognitive testing, and just in the same way that you do that with blue colours, so we're in a position to do that for cognitive performance. We want to be looking at how we design our cohorts. So classically we are moving from a public health cohort situation like CFAS, where you're having a representative sample, very, very difficult to achieve very high response rates, therefore by definition the sample remains small, to an etiological context where you're measuring, you're not really out to describe the population, you're out to describe causes and effects. And in that situation, what you're doing is achieving a large population which has consequent impact on your representativeness of your sample. But that large population, as a UK biobank, gives you statistical power. My expectation is as that data becomes more frequently available, we will be moving to an even bigger model, which I would describe as living laboratories, where we are collecting data from all sources, from how you shop, your health records, your educational records, online surveys, implicit measurements of how you're answering your phone, your vocabulary, your speed of response. All of these things will be available, and there will be pressure to use them. So let's look at next generation analytics, where they will be anchored in molecular and cellular mechanisms. The Wellcome Trust are investing hundreds of millions of pounds over the next, quite a few years. And to lead this, they're looking for someone who's going to invent neuroscience as the basis of mental health science. And it's very interesting that this focus on molecular and cellular mechanisms, I think, is absolutely inevitable. I'm looking at having hypothesis generation and testing much more closely aligned through machine learning and regression approaches. Currently what happens is we do our machine learning, oh, that's fantastic, what does it mean? And we do our regression approaches, oh, that's interesting, but we don't know what it means either. We're going to be bringing these two things together much more closely. And there'll be multimodal data routinely integrated by bringing together deep omics, linked data, survey data, imaging data, and even more digital data. Just as the Brain Health Project, I think, really is a pilot study, wonderful study, but actually a pilot study for what the future will look like over the next 5 to 10 years. So let's look at next generation data management. So we want to test realistically complex hypotheses, which actually, in principle, according to our understanding today, is extremely intrusive into your private lives. And who will allow that to happen? So there are barriers of who owns the data, how private can it be, and in which ways will you allow it to be exploited? Well, let me suggest to you a solution to this. Actually, it's joint ownership. It's not my ownership as a researcher. It's not the funder's ownership as the funder. But perhaps it's more the person's ownership as the individual. And once you have ownership issues sorted out, you then have a basis for establishing principles of governance. But then you might like to say, well, what we need to establish is the privacy of our data. And of course, that is a tiered issue. For some purposes, you would want this level of privacy. For another purpose, you want to achieve another level of privacy. So what you're really looking for are formal guarantees that levels of privacy can be observed. And I mean guarantees. And they're guarantees not because somebody has signed a piece of paper. They're guarantees because the mathematical operations mean they cannot otherwise be, that guarantee cannot otherwise be broken. And then you like to do your federated analysis. So what you're doing is bringing the analyst or the analysis to the data in a similar way that was being described by Sana. And in the Dimensions Platform UK, we are going to, we have what we call our data portal, and I invite you all to look at that. And at this data portal, you can identify data, you can apply for access to these data, and then you can analyze these data all within a secure, safe haven. Now this has taken years to achieve, but currently the data portal has a full data upload on roughly 1.3 million individuals, and a further upload on a per project basis of just over 2 million individuals. And we have other cohorts in process, which will be adding to the data portal over the next 12 months. This has taken years to achieve. We have had governance issues which have taken, I think, 18 months to resolve. We have all sorts of professional issues which have been very, very difficult to resolve. I really ask you to embrace the fact that the data environment is changing. And we need to work out ways of sharing, of accessing these data. Because if we don't, then other disciplines will do it for us. So, moving on to Dimensions Platform 2, which we are applying for this summer. We will develop our knowledge environment in terms of this data portal. We will be looking, if you like, to recruit from cohorts or from registers to experimental medicine studies, and we'll be developing partnerships. We already have, but we'll be developing further partnerships with industry and academic partners. So we think this integrated model of generating hypotheses through data, testing them through very highly targeted studies, and then triangulating the experimental studies, experimental findings with large-scale observational findings is a reasonable strategy for changing the culture. Thank you.
Thank you, John. That is quite extraordinary work that's been going on for many years. So, we are over time. I think that's the way things are going today. But who is the timekeeper here? Can we have 10, 15 minutes into the break for discussion? We do have a panel discussion scheduled. I don't see anyone saying no. Yes, so can I invite the panelists onto the stage, please? The microphone roaming.
Differently now that we're no longer thinking categorically about having or not having a diagnosis.
I think it depends where you're coming from. I think in cardiovascular epidemiology, although you might have a binary outcome, it's always been a matter of likelihood of whether the outcome is correct or not. And so I don't think it changes the methods. I think better measurement changes the opportunity.
In my field, I mean, it's interesting, the Americans moved to a diagnostic approach to suicidal behavior, which most of us this side of the Atlantic don't agree with. Defining an attempted suicide as a diagnosis, non-suicidal self-injury. I think that actually doesn't actually help the work. We're talking about a behavior which may reflect any sort of disorder or absence of disorder. So I suppose the way we approach it is a sort of dimensional approach, at least on this side of the Atlantic.
I think from our point of view, I mean, a dimensional approach is very helpful, but it depends on analytics. So in terms of your questionnaires, it's very useful to have a dimensional approach, but it's the way it's analysed. So I think Eleanor's was a very good example where she took a basic empirical approach to at what kind of point you really need to be worried, and showed very clearly at what kind of cutoff point you should be worried about children in the longer term. It was pretty clear. But the actual investigation that could allow it was a good dimensional measure.
Another question. Can I ask a question of John? Back to you, John. Yes. So we've heard that, I mean, one of the features of this department is really that it's moving into a lifespan approach to thinking globally, bringing all of these data systems together, and thinking very deeply about ethics and patient and carer and public involvement through that process. So I'm wondering, in a system as you're setting up the DPK, which seems to be such a model for the way we should be moving, how do you take, I mean, those are a lot of challenges, it seems to me, in setting up some of this, one of these data systems, the global, the life course perspective, engaging patients and the public. How do you fit all of that in?
Well, it's very difficult because different funders have different biases, or sorry, interests. And so the way we've addressed that is to try and focus different applications to different funders on the basis of their interests. So for the IMI Roadmap project, for example, which was essentially, we went for that because it supported work with the UK. There's a very broad-based stakeholder program, which IMI were very interested in. And so we used that as a lever. And what that did is bring together regulators, carers, patients, academics, industry partners, all in the same room to have a conversation. And it was an extraordinarily fruitful conversation, I have to say. So I recommend just trying to get everybody under the same.
So is that perhaps a challenge to funders to try to bring the funding emphasis together so that there can be just one funding application?
I think it was so helpful in Roadmap. It was so helpful to get to have money to bring people from across Europe with different, from different stakeholder communities to actually be reasonable in front of each other. And it worked very, very well.
Thanks, Eleanor. I think what people might have noticed in this way we structured these 2 days, it's a really interesting question, is that we've avoided any sort of split into child, adolescent, old age. Because I think that, you know, first of all, we're very multidisciplinary, very collaborative, and we believe in a kind of lifespan approach. But as John says, when things emerge, for example, the Wellcome Trust focus on young people, child anxiety, we need to be able to respond flexibly. So just as John says, and just to back that up actually, we can do what we think is right, but we have to be able to respond in a kind of agile and rapid way to those calls as they come out, because not everyone else will get it in the same way that we do.
Other questions? I think we look like people need a tea break.